much, because I know you're in between classes and some of you might have to leave, the others will come in. But I'm really pleased that you have turned out for what is going to be absolutely a riveting speech. And that's because of who Daud Vicary Abdullah really is, as you will see. But before I hand over the stage to Daud, I'd like to say a little bit about the Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities, because we are just a few months old. And as you might have already noticed, that we are about a variety of things. It is about finance, it is about law, and most of all, it's about communities. And this fits into what the University of East London is all about, which is about excellence, quality, diversity, but also community and civic engagement. So therefore, we link into the other centers here at this school and across the university by our human rights-based approach, by our pro-business approach. And so lawyers, business, and a variety of others would find that some of the interdisciplinary work that we do here fits into some of your expertise and your interest and so on and so forth. So we also are interested in, with a specific focus on issues of gender, issues of development, particularly in Africa. We're doing some work. We've already carried out work as far as the center is concerned, engaging with work in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Iraq. And we now have ongoing projects in Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in Syria. All these are very different, mostly linked to somehow law and Islamic finance. So welcome you to, I think you can see right ahead of me is Bob Reed, who is our communications coordinator. Please do get in touch, and once we have your emails, we'll be able to send out more information and more events such as this. And I also want to, please Bob.
If anyone wants to engage whilst the event's going on, the hashtag is on the screen at the moment.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, I also wanted to just mention that we have several members of CIFLAC over here and several members of staff. I can recognize Dr. Eva, Barry, and Asia, Edel. I'm sorry, who else have I left out? So it's nice to see a good mix of undergraduates, postgraduates, and colleagues out here. And if I've left out anybody, I'm really sorry. Okay, so now we have Daud Abdullah. I'm sure that in a short while, listening to him, you'll see the most powerful narrative, not only about Daud's own remarkable contributions to Islamic finance, but about Islamic finance itself, and about this great institution that we are very proud to be associated with, INCF, which is the Global University of Islamic Finance. It does a lot more than that. We'll get a sense of that in a moment. But I wanted to say a little bit about how remarkable Daud's own background is, that he's been in the business and financial industry for over 41 years, all over the world really, with significant experience in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Middle East. And I do know personally that if you just go into parts of America, if you talk about Islamic finance, one really thinks about Daud, because he's been working very closely not just with the World Bank and institutions and governments, but also with various important people. He's been in INCF and led it, 10 years now, Daud, INCF?
It's been around
INCF
10
years, but
I've been there 5.
But before that, he's been the Global Islamic Finance Leader with Deloitte, and also previously acting CEO of Asian Finance Bank, which is an Islamic finance bank based in Malaysia, and was the first Managing Director of Hong Leong Islamic Bank. Now, I would come between you and the great speaker, so I would have great privilege to invite Daud to please come and speak to us. You can lay down the rules of how you like to speak and how you like to engage.
Okay.
Thank you. Welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Siraj, thanks for the glowing introduction. I always get very nervous when I get introduced as a pioneer of this, because I don't think I am. I was just very fortunate and I was able to follow others. But thank you for the glowing introduction. I'll try and live up to it. It's always difficult to know what to talk about, so I'm going to talk about Islamic finance, past, present, and future, and try and chunk each bit into about 10 minutes and try and provoke some kind of reaction or interaction. I'm happy to field questions as we go. I'm also happy to take questions at the end, and Siraj will probably time me at and I'll probably do 30, 40 minutes, and then, you know, it's open for anybody, but please stop me as I go. It's sometimes difficult for me to sort of introduce myself. It's the first time I've been here. I've clearly introduced myself before, and I was just chatting. In fact, I signed an autograph here. I've done nothing but sign autographs since we're here, which is... But I signed an autograph here. I've just heard Shahina asked me the question, and she said, I Googled you and I looked you up on LinkedIn and whatever else, and you're not at all what I expected. With the name Daud Vicary Abdullah, you can clearly you know, get the message that I converted to Islam 25 years ago. But I don't, you know, I'm not quite what you expect. And my boss is the governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia, a great lady by the name of CIFLAC, who I could spend the rest of the day talking about her and what she's achieved for Islamic finance, but I won't, other than to say, when she asked me to do this job, I didn't think about it for too long. I suggested that yes, I'd love to do it. But she often describes me as the stealth weapon, and if you can imagine in meters, I'm 1.96 meters tall and I weigh about 106 kilos. Stealth is not a word that you would associate with me, but you just reminded me of I always like to open with an anecdotal story. And that anecdotal story is United States last year, I was invited to speak at something called the Global Insurance Symposium. And the only thing that was global about it was me, coming from Malaysia or UK originally. There were about 500 delegates at this symposium. 300 were CEOs and chief financial officers from the insurance industry in the United States, together with about 200 representatives of the regulators, the state's insurance regulators. And I've been asked to give a keynote address on Islamic insurance, Takaful. And I remember talking to the organizer, who's a good friend of mine. He's the president and CEO of a large US asset management company that partners with a Malaysian bank. And they've been doing Islamic finance together for probably the best part of a decade. And Larry asked me to come, and he said, if anybody can get a message across around Islamic finance in the Midwest of the US, and this is in Des Moines, Iowa, you can look that up on the map, but it's sort of plumb in the center of the US. He said, you're the one who can give the message. And I said, well, I may have a bit of a problem, because my name will be Daud Vicary Abdullah, which will arouse certain suspicions automatically. And if I entitle the presentation, Takaful Islamic Insurance, you know, what you need to know, I'm probably not going to get much of an audience. So I decided that my name would stay, but I would call the presentation More Similarities Than Differences, and sort of leave the subject matter a bit of a mystery till I got up. But there was still this Muslim guy who was going to talk about it. And of course, when I stood up in front of these 500 people, apart from one or two who knew me, they were all expecting somebody else than me. They were expecting somebody wearing dish dasher or having a beard, and somebody who was going to go Allahu Akbar every minute and a half. And I'm capable of doing that because I do, but not in front of this audience. So it was an interesting experience, and my approach in that presentation was really to describe similarities between mutual insurance and takaful, where there's huge similarities, and build a business case, and also describe to them, because there was a pushback from a lawyer, a trust lawyer, to say we couldn't accept Sharia law here in the United States, to which I responded, but you already have it. And he disagreed with me vehemently, and I asked him what sort of lawyer was he, and he said he was a trust lawyer. And I said, I'm not a lawyer, and I know there are lots of lawyers in the room here, so I have to tread carefully. And I said to him, well, what's the basis of US trust law? And the answer came back, English common law of trust is one of the bases of this. And I said, can you give me an early example of a trust contract in England which formed the basis of this common law? And he looked at me blankly and said, was it Roman or was it something? And I said, I'm sure the Romans have something. But the earliest recorded that I'm able to dig up is the foundation of Merton College, Oxford, in 1264, which uses an Islamic contract of waqf as the basis of its trust deed. And the reason it was used is because the Crusaders brought back from the Levant best practices, and the best practices were the concept of trust and waqf, which is an Islamic concept. So indirectly you have Islamic law here. It's a little bit tenuous, but I thought it opened up the discussion. Anyway, let me hit a button. I was told if I hit a button, something happens. There's an agenda. I really wanted to talk about talent development for a minute or two, and then where we've been as an industry, where are we, and where are we going? And this is a sort of stratospheric zoom through. So if you were expecting here to learn the technical differences and Sharia opinion on a particular commodity tawarruk or commodity murabaha contract, this is not the time or place. But I wanted to give some objectivity based on my experience in the industry, which now goes back 25 years or more. Talent development, nice pictures. By the way, I'm going to show you a slide at the end where you can download all of this, so you don't need to ask me that question, you just need to log on to our website. Education, perception, liquidity, the EPL concept. If you Google me, you'll find out that I'm the inventor of the EPL theory. It is true, but it's not that important that I invented this theory. It actually got invented as a joke. How many in this room follow, I'll call it's football, isn't it? Yeah, it's still English. Anybody follow football here at all? Nobody. A few are guilty, okay. Well, following football in Asia, which is where I've been based, certainly for a large part of my life, is a complete obsession. And with the 8-hour time difference in Malaysia, you will find at the 3 p.m. kickoff for Saturday at 11 p.m., most of the lights dimming through power, everybody is sat around a TV watching what they call the EPL, the English Premier League. They don't call it the Barclays Premier League or anything else, it's the EPL. And about, I can remember this now, it was 11 years ago, 2005, I'd just been appointed as the first managing director of a new bank, which I was setting up from scratch. A blank sheet of paper, an Islamic bank from a blank sheet of paper, Hong Kong Islamic Bank. And I was asked a question by the media as to what I thought were the 3 most important things that were going on in Islamic finance. And in a moment of complete madness, and this is why I call it a joke, it was on a Monday and it was after the football matches had been played, and all I had in my head was EPL, English Premier League, and can I say anything intelligent using that acronym of EPL? And what came to my lips, and I'm very thankful it did, was education, perception, and liquidity. Okay? And this is absolutely true. I didn't make it up. I'm not making the story up, but I made it up at that time. And it stuck with me, and it still applies. Education is vital, because without education, you don't change perceptions, and gosh, do we have a lot of misperceptions about Islam and Islamic finance. So education is vital to changing perceptions, and liquidity, as I was running a bank at that time, the biggest challenge I had was access to Sharia-compliant liquidity in order to fuel the growth of the industry. How many of you in this room have ever run a small business or run your own small business on the side at the moment? Anyone? Nobody? No entrepreneurs? Oh, there is some. I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you a question yet, but you will probably be aware that one of the most serious things you need to track and monitor running your own business is cash flow. And if it's negative, you're in trouble. And I don't have to go back to Dickens and Mr. Micawber, where I think he cited that annual expenditure £1 every year, annual income 21 shillings, luxury. But if it was annual expenditure 20 shillings, £1 every year, and annual income 19 shillings and sixpence, going back to old money shows that I'm from the land of the dinosaurs, you were in complete misery. Cash flow is absolutely vital, and access to liquidity is key. So I frequently revisit this, and I still get asked questions, what are the most important things in Islamic finance? And I still say this. even though my job has changed and my role has changed and I've consulted and I've run banks and now I'm running the university, education, perception and liquidity are the things that we need to focus on. I like this, let's get with it. Where have we been? A few minutes on the past, and depends where you start, but if I look at the last perhaps 30, 40 years, we've been building the market, we've been creating awareness, and we've been developing human capital. We've been doing lots of other things as well. But I wanted to comment on a couple of points here in terms of building the market. I'm not going to ask anybody's age in the room, so that would be inappropriate to do that. But I do recall learning from the real pioneers of Islamic finance in the modern era, a very important lesson which related to building the market. These people were very devout and sincere. Some of them were Sharia scholars. Some of them had been educated as Sharia scholars and moved into business. One particular friend of mine is a Sharia scholar, but he hasn't practiced. He studied at Al-Azhar, he's a Malaysian, studied at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and is the founding father of Islamic finance in Malaysia. I'm extremely fortunate that every Thursday I'm in KL. I still have breakfast with him to talk about issues, and he is the man who gave me my first insights into Islamic finance. And what he and others have shared with me in building the market is that Islamic finance could have taken one of two routes in the early days in the modern era. It could have tried to get started on the basis of fulfilling the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia and looking at things like risk sharing in financial services. In other words, equity type partnerships and so on and so forth. Or it could have done what it did do, which was to make Sharia compliant, and by make, I use the words advisedly, advisedly in the sense that I'm not suggesting that the Sharia scholars sort of forced an interpretation which made certain products allowable. But Islamic finance chose to go down a route where you guys out there in the street understand banking, you understand there's interest, you understand mortgage loans and auto finance and deposits. What we have here is Sharia compliant auto loans, mortgages and deposits. And we decided to go down that route in the early days, and the reason we did is because the audience wouldn't have understood 30, 40 years ago had we started talking to them about risk-sharing contracts like Mudaraba or Musharraf. And benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing. We're now in an era in Islamic finance, and I will talk about that later, where we're now having to re-educate a lot of the market about risk-sharing contracts and approaching it from the basis of the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia. But what we've got is effectively conventional finance with a Sharia wrapper. It is Sharia compliant, but it doesn't actually differentiate Islamic finance as significantly as it could or should. We've used constructs like leases, ijara, which look pretty much the same in the conventional world. Why? Because everybody can understand it. There are lawyers in the room, and again, I'm always hesitant when there are experts in here, but the whole legal system around the world, sweeping generalization because legal systems do change around the world, but the legal system around the world generally reinforces the position of the creditor rather than the debtor. The tax systems around the world certainly reinforce debt as opposed to equity or risk-sharing type finance. And that in itself presents us with considerable challenges in order to get a foothold in Islamic finance. So I go back to my early days in this industry, which was in the early 1990s, when I remember when we hit a target of $100 billion of assets. 100 billion, that's all, next to nothing. We're now at 2 trillion plus, and which is still only about 1% of global assets, by the way, so we've still got a long way to go. But it's a significant number which people are paying attention to. The awareness has been created. I was talking earlier in the session and not everybody was there, so I'll share a couple of anecdotes in terms of creating awareness. I've had a sense, because I've been in the industry for 25 years, that there was some kind, is it okay if I walk around? I know it's old age or something, I need to keep the joints moving. I've had a sense for many years in the industry, and particularly during the 90s and the early zeros of this century, that there was an expectation amongst regulatory authorities, and I won't name any, but the accounting profession or the accounting regulators, the central bank regulators, the Bank of International Settlements, were kind of trying to ring-fence Islamic finance and treat it as an annoying mosquito that may bite them, and they were just doing this a lot of the time and hoping that Islamic finance would go away and it would not die a natural death as a result of lack of interest. There was also a lot of feeling in not just in the industry but globally, and it's only in the last 5 or 6 years that I do not get asked this question. And the question I used to get asked most frequently in the 90s and in the early, what do you call them, the noughties, is it? Some clever term for it, but early 2000s, the noughties. The question I used to get asked most frequently was, do I have to be a Muslim to participate in Islamic finance? And everybody in this room knows the answer is, no, you don't. Of course you don't. But the expectation of the answer was interesting, because I always sensed that people, when they asked that question, and they were non-Muslim, they were expecting an answer as, actually you do. In which case they've asked a very nice question, thank you so much, I'm really interested in what you're doing, but of course it's not for me. And when you respond, it's for everyone and it's for the benefit of all humanity, you've created some level of engagement, and they'd rather not be there to have the discussion about this. And sometimes I think some of my fellow practitioners, and indeed myself, have approached the ongoing conversation perhaps in the wrong way. 20 years ago I would have gone into some completely unintelligible ramble about riba and the fact that we didn't use interest. If anybody here in this room is trying to explain Islamic finance through trying to explain riba and ribawi products, don't go there. Yes, try to understand it yourself, but it's not a good place to start explaining what Islamic finance is, because you will tie yourself up in knots. And most of the world out there is perfectly used to an interest-based system, and somehow they've been deluded that it's a measurement of risk, which of course it isn't, because interest rates are actually set by governments and they're not a measurement of risk anymore. But it's a bad place to start. A good place to start, and I'm not saying you should follow my example, but it may work. You can grab attention by saying, if you were a US audience, in fact this actually may work for you. In the US, every year the capital market, in terms of raising money in the capital market, churns $33 trillion every year. That is at least 10 times the size of Islamic finance globally. $33 trillion. What percentage of that $33 trillion in the United States actually goes into the real economy? Now, a question you may ask me, so I'll anticipate it, is what's the real economy? And those of you who are under 40 may not understand that. We had something in the 80s called the Big Bang, where all of a sudden banks, financial institutions, capital markets, stock exchanges and everything were forced together through interesting legislation that was brought in largely by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And the banking profession, this was before I converted to Islam or even understood it, but the banking profession started going in a very weird direction. And the weird direction was they started doing lots of things called product engineering and lots of stuff that was off balance sheet. And the banking system that I was brought up in and joined as a young man in 1973 when I graduated was about pure financial intermediation, being in society and actually assisting those people who had surplus funds, paying them a reasonable rate of return and investing it wisely and using that money to actually fuel the economy by lending it to people who needed it for construction, houses, education of their children, building schools, roads and hospitals. You know, perfectly ideal. Real economy stuff. Real things, real assets. And all of a sudden in the 80s, we opened up this market called the financial economy. And those of you who studied the global financial crisis will understand that that financial economy, based on these derivatives, where the underlying asset is 8 or 10 stages removed from where you are. You know, you're talking about collateralized debt obligations, you're talking about mortgages, business that nobody understood. That's what brought the global financial crisis around. Why? Because we lost sight on what the real economy is. So I'll come back to my question. 33 trillion in the US every year is churned in the capital market. What percentage of that 33 trillion in the United States finds its way into financing real assets, real things which make a difference to the real economy? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Percentage? 10%? Less. 1%? Less. Yeah. 99.2% of that 33 trillion goes into the financial economy. 0.8% goes into the financing of real assets which make a difference to the man and woman in the street. Something new is being built or created which makes a difference. The rest is just trading financially on existing assets and making a turn on it. And you wonder why we have problems in the world. Okay, so that's my introduction to Islamic finance. And I've used this in the US. I used it at a speech that I gave 3 years ago for the World Bank at the IMF Spring Meeting in 2012. And the response was actually quite constructive because they said, yes, we're beginning to realize this, that we can't keep printing money, we can't do this, we've got to actually focus on some old-fashioned values. It's going to take time to get back there, but that's what Islamic finance is about. It's about financing the real economy. And in order to do that, we need to sort of start doing some re-education, and we need to develop human capital in a way that they actually understand this, and they don't understand, the old way. The old way, using interest, actually was okay, although as a Muslim, interest isn't okay. When you had financial intermediation, which actually took deposits, gave a return on it, and then invested that money in real projects in the real economy, that was fine. Granting of interest was not so fine, but the reality was the risk sharing, it was the financial intermediation that has changed. I'm conscious of time. Where are we now? Whoa. This is something, well, I've just got one slide on this, which, as you've noticed, I try and keep succinct. We're at an interesting point right now. I put up there something called the tipping point. And the tipping point is that post-global financial crisis, there has been increasing interest in where Islamic finance is at. You're in London, and I'm sure, who here has heard of Professor John Kay? Don't say nobody. This is where I say shame on you. Professor John Kay is a professor at London School of Economics. He writes regularly in the Financial Times. And he has been quite critical of the rise of debt. In fact, he's just published a book called Other People's Money, which very articulately describes what I've just described to you, much better than I can. He's not a Muslim. He's an English gentleman. Who's heard of Lord Adair Turner? Yes. Lord Adair Turner, 5 days after Lehman Brothers crash, took over the helm of the FSA here. He also happens to be a visiting professor at the Institute. He's not a Muslim. Religiously, he's an agnostic. He's a very intelligent man. Again, the reason for his interest in Islamic finance is because Islamic finance doesn't like debt so much. We tolerate it, it's okay, but not as our life force. He likes the idea of risk sharing, equity participation. and getting back to some values. His most recent book, which I strongly recommend to you, it was published in October last year. It's called Between Debt and the Devil. It's actually, some ladies were very nice about the book I wrote a few years ago, saying it was readable. I think you were saying it was readable. You probably said something even nicer, but it was readable. Adair's book is very, very readable because it doesn't use what I call rocket science formulas. It explains what is going on. I've just had lunch with the Professor of Business and Economics at Kingston University, Professor Stephen King, who's actually quite radical on this, and he's using Minsky's theory of finance to really develop a global model which basically says we've got to get back to risk sharing, otherwise you think the 2007-2008 crisis was bad, the next one is coming, and it will be probably 10 times worse. So the tipping point is really being reached in that we have got lots of supporters for the concepts of Islamic finance from leading economists, Western economists. Joe Stiglitz is another one, Nobel laureate, who are really raising the right questions and saying, can we keep doing what we've been doing? We should probably be rethinking that. So my sense is that we are at a tipping point. We also need to harness your energy, and this is why I like this term, harnessing creative disruption. Things like crowdfunding, things like some of the things you're doing on the legal side. Siraj and I talk often, probably not as often as I'd like us to talk, but we do talk quite often. And I'm fascinated by the work that's been going on in terms of gender equality, in terms of access to finance, in terms of crowdfunding type initiatives, in terms of human rights, legal issues, all of which are very consistent with the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia. And it's harnessing that kind of creative disruption. We're not doing it just to be deliberately disruptive, but frankly, we probably have to do this in a constructive way in order to change the world. We can't keep doing what we're doing. The objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia, we have to move, and this is coming on to the final point, some tough choices. For many years now, the Sharia scholars have been directed by regulators and by authorities to look primarily at the Sharia viability of a product. In other words, they've been asked, is this product Sharia compliant? And there's been lots of toing and froing, depending on which Sharia school of thought you're on, or with, as to whether it's valid or not. In actual fact, when I was at Deloitte nearly a decade ago, we did a study of all the fatwas that have been issued around fiqh muamalat, around financial transactions, and we did by all the schools of thought in the previous 15 years. And there were a couple of thousand, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands. What was very, very interesting in that study was that all the various Sharia schools of thought were in complete agreement 95% of the time. So there was only what I would call a healthy difference of 5%. So it's a misrepresentation that the Sharia schools of thought have these major big differences. They're workable and they're healthy and everybody respects each other, and 95% of the time we get on with our lives. But we have some tough choices here in terms of Sharia, and this really revolves around not just approving a contract or a construct and saying it is okay. It's about looking beyond that. It's about the usage of the contract and fulfilling the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia. Let me give you a simple example. A leasing contract in Islamic finance is called an ijara. That ijara construct at the moment is looked at and approved by Sharia scholars and the Sharia board at a financial institution. And they're saying this construct is okay. And then they may ask the question, what are you going to use this lease contract for? And the answer comes back and says, we're going to buy a Caterpillar bulldozer. And the Sharia scholars say, well, that's probably okay. You're going to use it to, help construct things. What if that Caterpillar bulldozer, and I'm using a real example here, is then used to demolish over the next 6 months 20,000 hectares of rainforest in Borneo. Is that Sharia compliant or not?
No.
The answer is no, it's not. But the Sharia scholars aren't looking at that. They're just looking at the legality of the contract, not the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia and the way in which that asset is being used. Yes?
Is this shifting really from a viewpoint of compliance to innovation and development beyond what is simply just saying it is Sharia, but moving on to trying to reach those high idyllic goals that Sharia law tries to stand for?
The answer to that is yes. I think we're at this interesting tipping point now, and I was sharing with people at the is it a reception or a coffee or something? You're in the other reception talking about. The answer is I believe that there are some tough choices here. However, there is a willingness to move in this direction, but it's going to be difficult to do it because people get set in their ways, and it fundamentally boils down to an issue of form rather than substance. I tick the box, I said this is okay, but I'm not actually looking at the substance or the intention of the transaction and how it is used. And to be fair, it's difficult sometimes to actually find out what the intention is. It's not publicly declared. And I was sharing with the group beforehand, and if you're not familiar with it, you will be in a moment. 2007, 2008, a professor at George Washington University and his research team came out with something called the Islamicity Index. You can Google that, you can look it up. When I spoke at Warwick University 3 nights ago, somebody Googled it and actually gave me the charts on it, because otherwise it's in my memory. But this Islamicity Index, which was published by Professor Hussein Askari, A-S-K-A-R-I, is updated every couple of years, and what it looked at is every country in the world, and it looked at every country in the world as to the extent to which they had implemented the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia. And those sort of objectives are, gender rights, property rights, legal rights, transparency, etc., etc. And guess what the #1 country was in 2007? It may have changed slightly, but it was Ireland, followed by New Zealand and followed by Iceland and the Scandinavian countries. And then UK was about 8 or 9, US 12 or 13, and you came down the list, and the highest Muslim majority country in achieving the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia was Malaysia at number 33. Yeah? Now, this is not looking at, do you pray 5 times a day? Do you perform, do you perform Hajj? Do you give to zakat? Do you frequently, give to sadaqah, and so on? It's not looking at that. It's looking at the fundamental principles of Islamic finance, or of Islam, in terms of its role within humanity. What is even scarier is that Israel ranks higher than any GCC country. Saudi's about number 97 or 99. And this is about perceptions. The perception is in the West that the heartland of Islam is the GCC. It's not. In terms of population, in terms of its understanding of Islam, in terms of its understanding of the Quran, in terms of its interpretation of the Quran, it is challenged. It's only in recent years that Saudi Arabia has actually embraced and developed Islamic finance. Up until 3 years ago, most of what you saw in finance in Saudi Arabia was completely haram. Completely and utterly haram. That's all the business they did. And all the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, announced was, well, it's very difficult because everybody assumes, because we're a Muslim country, particularly our own people, it will be very hard for us to announce that we're now doing Islamic finance because everybody assumes that we are, when in fact they weren't. I won't dwell on that. I'll let you read the study because it's updated every couple of years. But we have some tough choices to make, and the tough choices are our Sharia scholars need to follow through on the substance rather than the form, and start looking at how we actually achieve the objectives of Maqasid al-Sharia. I'm for one, I'm raising the issues. I'm not doing this to be critical. It's a statement of fact. We've got a long way to go when a country like New Zealand, because of its rule of law, because of property rights, because of freedom of speech, actually ranks more highly than the highest ranked Muslim majority country, Malaysia, at 33. That I'm horrified by. When I first read the report, I was absolutely horrified. You know, I thought it was a CIA-produced thing, but it's not. It's real. So we have some tough choices. Let me move on. What's coming? Whoa, well, what's coming, and again, there's one slide on this. I talked about risk sharing. I think the mindset of the world is now a little bit more focused on risk sharing. There are concerns even amongst the people on the street about the financial crisis, the fact that they lost money, that the banks that they trusted lost money, are being bailed out by governments too big to fail, deposit insurance has bailed them out, and their share prices have gone down, and their pension schemes have gone to pot. The idea of risk sharing is now getting a little bit more traction, and we need to be able to articulate that clearly. We're seeing some great momentum with linkages in the last 12 months or so between Islamic finance and what's called corporate social responsibility, responsible and ethical finance. I'm very proud to say, or I'm proud to have been selected as a member of the Board of Trustees of the RFI Foundation, the Responsible Finance Institute Foundation. It had its first meeting in Edinburgh, Scotland, on 31st of August last year. There was an initial conference around this, and it brought together practitioners of Islamic finance with responsible finance and ethical finance. And they've decided now to hold a summit, which will be held at the end of March in Kuala Lumpur. Bob, you've probably seen, you're retweeting a lot of the stuff on our RFI. I'm very encouraged, and many others are encouraged, that we're actually getting a level of engagement with other people who share similar values. Similar values to Islamic finance in terms of the ethics and the sense of responsibility of how finance is used. Risk sharing is a key part of this, and changing the mindset is absolutely vital. One of the toughest things to do is to change people's minds. You're all aware of it, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, but I ask your forgiveness for that. But it's so easy for people not to think because they've heard a 10-second soundbite on CNN or on Fox News. Somebody says they're the evil empire. You just look at it, in terms of certain presidential campaigners for the nomination of the Republican Party. Not naming names, but you can figure that out. That there's this sort of power, and I know enough about history, although I wasn't around. A certain Austrian-born dictator started in pretty much the same way, and these things are really a little scary. They're changing the mindset because they've got access to the media, and people don't want to stop and think about it too much. But if we collectively do want to stop and think about it and come up with convincing arguments with regards to the value of responsible finance, that getting back to risk-sharing techniques rather than just printing more and more money, that will help work. A large part of the work that we're doing at INSIF, and this is I promise is the only sort of promotional bit I'll do, better education and awareness. INSIF started 10 years ago, and at the time it was started, I was the CEO of an Islamic bank, and I was presented with a number of challenges running a bank, an Islamic bank, not least of which was where are the good people who are going to succeed me, and who's going to be head of treasury, and who's going to be head of retail banking, and whatever else. There was a shortage in the marketplace, even in Malaysia, 10 years ago. One of the solutions that was put forward through discussion with the central bank was that, well, we're going to create a postgraduate university, they called it INSIF, and we're going to focus on producing medium to long term, and by that they meant 5 to 7 years out, better qualified people who had master's type degrees but with an industry perspective. And INSIF was set up and it developed its curriculum largely based on input from the industry, which is still the case today. 95% of my Senate and my governing council and my board are not made up of academics. They're made up of regulators and global practitioners running Islamic financial institutions. all over the world. Yet we are an academic institution. Our first program was something called the Chartered Islamic Financial Professional, CIFP. It's now called MIFP. We've improved it. And 33 people joined it in 2007 from 7 countries. Since then, we've now graduated 1,087 PhDs and masters in Islamic finance from 67 countries around the world. And we have on our books today 2,000 masters and PhD students from over 80 countries around the world. And we're part of the better education and awareness. You know, we have a mission. It was initially for Malaysia, but it very quickly became global. And it became global because of the standards and because of the quality. And we have 33 full-time faculty teaching Islamic finance, including a former executive director of the IMF, Professor Abbas Miracle, who I know Siraj is familiar with, who's been a mentor of mine for many, many years. But it's about enhancing the debate and the discussion around education and awareness. And that's why I really personally enjoy having the opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes, and also the fact we have a relationship with UEL, and we'd like to see how we can grow and develop that, because it is the exchange of knowledge. It's about creating better education and awareness, and just joining up the dots. Yeah, it's when you hear something which is wrong, we need to challenge it. We need to challenge it with facts and with education to say, if you think this is what Islamic finance represents, or this is what Islam represents, think again, because these are the facts. So I'm going to leave it at that. We've got, I think, some time for questions and answers. This is the point where I say, ask me anything, and all I can say is no, or I don't know the answer, which is probably to most of the questions. And also, we have a website, and you can see the details there. This presentation is on there, as well as probably everything I've done in the last 12 months, and access to our research and our knowledge management centre and whatever else. So I'm going to leave it at that point, but I'm here and I'm happy to take any questions, and you're controlling time, so
Yeah, sure.
and I know other people have got other things to do. So thank you so much. Okay, so
Shall I take 3 questions at a time? Would you
Yeah.
prefer, or would you take one at a time?
I'll try 3, but you may have to remember them for me, because it's late in the day. Let's go ahead.
I've been to a number of talks on Islamic finance, and one of the focuses seems to be trying to deal with internal policy and internal goals of Islamic finance companies to turn their internal policies and their human resource policies from something that is haram to halal. And when I've talked to certain investment banks, they seem to have had serious issues with implementing the correct HR policy that would reflect Sharia law within the internal policy structure of the banks themselves.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how can we implement this education and development if the institutions themselves are haram and not halal?
Okay,
Okay.
that's one question. I'll
One
try.
question.
Going by your second slide, where we been,
Yeah.
you did talk about building the market, creating awareness, most importantly, the human capital development. Now, I want to ask, what is the relevance of Islamic finance? What's the relevance of Islamic finance to a country like Nigeria?
What is the relevance of it?
Islamic finance in a country.
Okay.
Yep. Question there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I should thank the presenter, of course. We've learned a lot, and it is a privilege to hear from you directly, a famous scholar of Islamic finance. And we really, as students in that field, we really admire you for what you're doing. So, given your experience, very vast experience at the industry and in the academics, I'm asking a question. How receptive the Islamic financial institutions are when it comes to research and innovations? For example, I am looking at the question of murabaha, the innovations in the field of murabaha, the difference between the classical murabaha and the conventional murabaha of the present day. So what I'm looking at exactly is to what extent the present-day Murabaha is sustainable under the Sharia?
Good questions. Let me try and answer them in order, and all of them are probably will be fairly lengthy, but I'll try and answer. Your question about policies and investment banks and so on, I really think that sometimes there is an overreaction from certain parties representing Islamic finance to say all of this stuff must be perfect before you can move forward. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was fortunate enough in my second spell at Deloitte to be selected to help implement the first Islamic bank in China, Bank of Ningxia, N-I-N-G-X-I-A, 2008-2009. And there were some very clear guidelines from the regulatory authorities and from state and central authorities in China that they would only permit certain things to happen within this Islamic bank. Certain products were prescribed on the financing side, so on the asset side of the balance sheet, and only one product was prescribed on the liability side, the deposit side. And I remember being there looking at this stuff after we'd won the contract and talking with my fellow partners from Deloitte, who were Chinese, part of the Chinese business, trying to practice. And I said, well, we're not really going to get very far with this infrastructure because I don't see how we're going to be able to move forward, how we were going to do funding, how we were going to do liquidity, because the whole market was stacked against us. There were no Sharia-compliant funds available. And my colleagues at Deloitte in China advised me strongly not to go and pick a fight with the regulator and tell them they were all wrong and we needed in this space. They advised me quite correctly not to go and have an argument on this, but to accept what we'd been given and to see what we could do within the confines that we had. From a Sharia perspective, in China, within Ningxia, which is the province which is north-central, it's just below Mongolia, just south of the Yellow River, it's predominantly the Hui people who have been Muslim for 400 or 500 years. There are Sharia scholars there, but their Sharia knowledge is not so much on business, but muamalat, it's more on religious issues. And I was discussing the challenge with them, and to be quite honest, it was over their heads because they didn't actually understand Islamic finance at all. So I asked for some advice from a Sharia scholar friend of mine who said, look, what's important here is that you get Islamic finance moving, even with some imperfections. And you can use maslahah as a concept in terms of in the public interest. But what you have to remember is that you're using maslahah, you should use it on the basis that it's time-bound. So say that it's 5 years and we can accept deposits from haram sources in order to get this thing going. So my answer to you there is that we can't, particularly in developing environments or countries which are not Muslim and don't follow Sharia law, it's extremely difficult to say this is how it should be. And you get lots of people who know a great deal about Sharia but don't know much about change management or running a business, where actually the objective is that everybody learns as we go along and we're aiming at a particular target and we're actually measuring people's intention. And in Islam that's called niyat. What is your intention to do this? Rather than, so it's the substance of the intention rather than the letter of the law and the form. I hope that answers you, but it is a challenge. But part of it is actually getting it across to the Sharia guys to say, I'm not saying be lenient, but you need to look at this practically. If you're trying to move this further forward, then you need to look at it on the basis of how you would practically move it forward and get more people on side with this. You know, the impression I get through reading the Daily Mail, which I don't, but if I did read the Daily Mail, the impression I would get is that, you know, this is the evil empire and that Sharia law has got through the back door. I was reading something the other day that the properties which are used to back the UK sukuk, you know, aren't allowed to serve alcohol because it's Sharia law through the back door. Come on, guys, you've got better things to do. Your question on Nigeria is a great question because because I don't know the exact demographic split, but it's kind of 50-50, isn't it? Muslim and Christian.
Not really 50-50.
But it's,
Christian tend to less when compared to Muslim.
has a great honor. I mean, the huge challenges there, and a lot depends on situations which I don't really understand enough about in Nigeria. I have Nigerian students. A good friend of mine, who used to be governor of the central bank, Dr. Zanussi, now His Royal Highness the Emir of Kano. You know him, I know him. He was in Edinburgh. He's also on, shares with me a seat on the board of trustees of the Responsible Finance Institute. He has certainly helped me understand the situation. In a nutshell, I think it is about education and persistence. You know, I think there's a lot of misgivings are held because people don't stop and debate and really try to understand what is going on. They're just, you know, it's like, you know, there are all sorts of age-old arguments which have gone on. You know, Protestant against Catholic, you know, Northern Ireland, you've seen that. You know, situations in India and elsewhere, and in the end, you know, catastrophic things happen, and then people just sort of wake up and say, we better do something more constructive. But I think the value proposition of Islamic finance, if I'm looking at it from a business standpoint, is that if you can actually align Islamic finance with greater financial inclusion and productivity, economic productivity, it is the key area. And then people will realise that it does and can make a difference, and then it will be taken a little bit more seriously. The third question was on research and innovation, and great question. In fact, all three are great questions. Yeah, I mean, Murabaha has been the basis. I think it was you was asking it. Yeah, and you may be aware of the consultative document the Bank of England has pushed out on liquidity management, and it's largely based on a commodity Murabaha basis. More advanced Islamic economies, and I'm looking at Malaysia, are moving away from this because commodity Murabaha, as I'm sure you're aware because you asked the question, it is basically close to the borderline in terms of being a bit creative in terms of artificially creating a transaction in order to produce the liquidity. Okay. There are other ways of doing this, but it depends on the sophistication of the marketplace. So what is interesting in Malaysia, and I can give that as an example, INCIF does a lot of research. The research is funded specifically by industry and by regulators. The likes of the World Bank and the IMF contribute to us. BNP Paribas sponsor us for research. Several Islamic banks do. And they're asking us to look at these kind of things. The regulators are asking us to look at it. Indeed, the Bank of England is consulting with us specifically on this. And today is what? Monday? Wednesday morning, UK time, my senior team are talking with the chief economists of the Bank of England on other options besides using Murabaha in order to raise liquidity. The real issue here is encouraging linkages with industry that promote relevant research, which isn't sort of esoteric academic research, but it's real research that makes a difference. We're fortunate at INCIF in that we're founded in a country which is interested in Islamic finance and is encouraging it, so therefore we've had a relatively easy journey, and that our infrastructure and governance is such that industry practitioners from around the world are on our representative bodies, and 99% of the research we do is actually driven by them. You know, we're not thinking it up. Well, we are thinking some of it up, but we're thinking it up with them to say we should be having a point of view on these things. So I do see movement in that direction. If you remember my first segment on, you know, where we've come from, things like commodity Murabaha and the use of the London Metal Exchange in order, that's the old school way of artificially creating the transaction or the liquidity to be able to do the financing. And some Sharia scholars now frown on it a lot more, but you know, but bear in mind they did approve it originally. I think they've moved on from that, and that is very much part of yesterday's world. We need to be looking at getting much more participation through you know, private equity, through Mudaraba type transactions and indeed Musharaka transactions. But that is part of the educational process. And the demonstration effect of the research will be an important part of that. If the research demonstrates that this is more economically efficient, it's cheaper to do it, you know, the capital market runs more efficiently. I mean, every treasurer of a listed company in Malaysia knows that he can go to the market to raise money Islamically and raise it 25 basis points cheaper than he can conventionally. So it's a no-brainer that people look at Islamic finance. Why? Because it's economically more efficient. But Malaysia, you know, had to work hard, and it was that tipping point was reached probably 15 years ago, and it took time. Yeah, it took time. Some more?
Yeah, I think I'm better move in the middle because in case I'm missing some from the side. So one question, maybe also on the side. Okay, 2, 3.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. So we go.
Yep.
My question is a bit on the radical. How would you react to a claim that this entire concept of Islamic finance must a deep-seated conceit that Islam has against Western civilization, and I use that word advisedly? And how would you seek to dislodge your ideology from those that inform terrorism as we see proliferated around the world today?
Okay. That's an interesting question. Okay.
Conspiracy.
Okay.
Got a question there? Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, with the mentioned characteristics on the ethical best practices of Islamic finance, how effective can it be to help achieve the sustainable development goals that is currently a problem in many countries, especially third world countries, and particularly in a country like Nigeria that is having dwindling oil receipts and facing security issues, budgetary deficiencies and stuff like that. How can it become effective and of advantage?
Okay.
Thank you. And a final question in this round.
So there's been a lot of discussion about conventional banking versus Islamic banking, and this is particularly the case during the crisis that's happened. Some argue that Islamic banking had a platform because they didn't lose as much finance as conventional banking. However, there has been evidence that they didn't exactly have as much funding come back up since the crisis, so they've had a major slowdown. I understand they take in liquidation and they keep a high percentage following the Basel II, and maybe even more than what the Basel II requires. How's Basel III going to affect it, and how will it increase it going forward?
Okay. They're all good questions, and I'll try to do them justice. I mean, I hope I got your question right about the ideology. I think I have to answer this from a personal perspective, because I think that's the only way I can go with it. I converted to Islam 25 years ago, largely as a result of being exposed to Islamic finance for the first time, and having Islamic finance and the fundamentals of Islam explained to me by a series of individuals, but more importantly by the demonstration of their actions about how they live their lives. And at that time I was very, I was going through changes in my own life, and I was very receptive to the demonstration effect of this wasn't like, a proactive conversion, because as Muslims you're not permitted to proactively convert anyone. You have to demonstrate the good and the values which you represent in Islam. So from the point of view of ideology, I'm extremely nervous about ideology and people getting the wrong end of the stick. In other words, they focus on a particular phrase and say this is what we must all go away and do, and because they're a powerful orator, they persuade others to follow who don't stop and think about it. And they don't look at the whole issue in totality. So you know, my stance on, you know, the terrorism and on ISIS and elsewhere is that sadly they're greatly misguided, that this is not the Islam that I've learned to grow in and love, and what provoked me to convert. There's a great deal of good in it, and there I'll be very conservative in my response. Sadly, they're greatly misguided because they misuse and misrepresent Islam totally. And I hope that answers the question, that gives you, an idea on that, because it has no place. It has no place in the religion that I have embraced, and as I call it a convert. Some people say revert. I'm never comfortable with revert, but as a convert to Islam, I made a specific choice, and the choice I made was about the values that Islam represents. The second question was, how effective is Islamic finance in responsible finance? And you were asking that question. This is both a good question, but it's also challenging. I think, the answer from where I sit is that how effective has it been? It has in pockets. It has, developed some greater financial inclusion, but largely, in my experience globally, it's just another thing which is wrapped up in a different way. It's sort of a Sharia wrapper, so it looks Islamic, it is Islamic, but it still walks and quacks like a duck, so it looks like conventional finance. So I don't think we've done as much as we could or should, and we're now at this tipping point where we do need to start addressing these issues around responsible finance and ethics and linking these things together, and really looking at our clear value proposition. It's not sufficient to say that, for example, if you invested money in the Dow Jones Sharia-compliant index in 2003 and left it there till 2013, and you invested a similar amount over a similar period in the Dow Jones index, in actual fact you would be considerably better off if you'd invested in the Sharia-compliant index. I mean, that's nice, but we actually need to understand why. We had the global financial crisis in between, and we're looking at a limited range of investments. So I think we've still got much more work to do in terms of getting the value propositions across and really determining the differentiation that's there. And what is interesting, and I alluded to it in my presentation, that some Western economists, and I'm looking here at Steve Keen and Ann Pettifor and John Kay and Adair Turner, are actually raising the flag around debt and looking at more equity participation and risk sharing. And that in some ways gives Islamic finance credibility, which and I always like to use simple analogies, which the Sharia scholar, when they stand up and in front of an audience in the United States, and not that they ever get the chance to do it very often, don't get that message across somehow, because they focus on specific issues and they convey things in a different way. I use a term very often. I use this term, speaking to the audience is listening. I know some stuff. I don't know anything. I don't know everything. I do know something. I don't know nothing. Is that right? That's a double negative. I don't know everything on this. But I know enough about certain subjects where it really depends on the audience and the participation about how you actually address it. I didn't know you, but I had, I can make some reasonable assumptions that you're, a reasonably intelligent audience because you're at a university and you've got an interest in this stuff, so I can talk about things at a certain level. But if you are addressing a very intelligent technical audience that consists of monetary policy specialists representing central banks of the Basel Committee around the world, they are technically very, very proficient, but they sort of shut out the Islamic bit because they think it's a religious thing or it's associated with terrorism. So the way you address the argument there is that you've got to find some common ground around the technical competency and say, well, what if you looked at it this way? Here's an equation. Why would you look at it this way? So speaking to the audiences listening is going to be very important, but I think we've got a lot of growing up to do in really getting both messages across and being effective and demonstrating that we've got it better. The answer to your question, I mean, I think it's largely around Basel II, although we've moved on to Basel III. There are some real challenges here, and in part I've answered your question by the previous one. The Basel Committee and other regulatory authorities around the world and standard setting authorities have for a large part sort of just shut out Islamic finance because it was, as I describe it, this annoying mosquito that was going to bite them, but they just go shoo, 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 and you hope the mosquito goes away. Now the mosquito is there, and there's a whole flock of them, if that is the term for a flock. There are lots of mosquitoes, and they are biting, so they have to pay attention. The challenge that the Basel Committee has is that they have set up a financial stability infrastructure which effectively has not taken into consideration the advantages that Islamic finance can bring. They're not in denial about this, because I sat on, and have sat on the Financial Stability Board of the Islamic Development Bank, and we presented to the Basel Committee December 2010 on the advantages of Islamic finance and what we do. And we were listened to very attentively, and I wrote a paper on liquidity management and the need for greater short-term liquidity. And I believe these organizations are now starting to listen, because a critical mass has been achieved, and there are some options and alternatives out there. And therefore, listening to what Islamic finance has to say, there is in part, there's an engagement and there's a dialogue that's saying, well, maybe there's some stuff we can learn here, but we're going to have to do some things differently. Whereas in the past it was, well, this is the system and you're not in it. Now they're saying, well, you can be in it, and you're getting a wider level of acceptance. In accounting standards, for example, since 1993 we've had AOFI, the Accounting and Auditing Association of Islamic Financial Institutions, which established some standards to plug the gap between the conventional and the Islamic world. The reality of the situation is I think AOFI standards are actually only adopted in 4 countries around the world. And many Muslim countries and leaders in Islamic finance haven't adopted AOFI standards, Malaysia and Indonesia being 2. The reason for that is that the general accounting standards bodies, which are represented by IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, have over the last decade embraced Islamic finance much more than was apparent 10 years ago. In fact, every 4 years, anybody an accountant in the room? A qualified accountant? You are, I am. What's your qualification? ICCA. I'm a CPA Australia for my sins. My apologies to you, and I apologise to myself. But if you can imagine, every 4 years there's something called the World Congress of Accountants, and it's kind of like the Olympics for accountants. And frankly, only accountants get excited about this, but everybody else is, 4,000 accountants gather. In 2010, they gathered in Kuala Lumpur, and of course Islamic finance was on the agenda. They spent 1 day out of the 3 doing nothing but Islamic finance. And I spoke at that conference, and my expectation was, well, that was nice, we're in KL, they felt obliged to do it, but they won't follow through. 4 years later, the next Olympics for the accountants was held in Rome, World Congress of Accountants, in November 2014. Guess what? I'm invited, along with many other practitioners and regulators who are focused on Islamic finance, and we spent a whole day doing the same thing as we did in Kuala Lumpur, but taking it to another level. The accounting profession is starting to take Islamic finance on board. If you look at your own organisation, you look at CPA Australia, ACCA, and all these guys, they're all doing Islamic finance programs. Why? Because from the accounting profession's standpoint, they have to service an increasing level of Islamic finance business. It's not just banks and insurance companies and asset management companies, it is businesses which are using Islamic constructs to fund their growth and development and fund mergers and acquisitions and whatever else, and the accountants need to figure out what's going on. So that level of acceptance is starting to increase. The financial crisis, I'll be quite, Islamic finance was small, and everybody said, well, if we'd all done Islamic finance, the crisis wouldn't have happened. I'm not so sure. Muslims are greedy as well. You know, we're not necessarily better than everybody else. Islamic finance at the time of the crisis was very small, and we were impacted by property prices. And because a lot, and you saw the downturns in Dubai and the UAE, there was a big decline in property prices, and that impacted on the performance of Islamic financial institutions. But having said that, I think there's now greater diversification, and there's a deeper understanding amongst regulatory authorities, accounting, the IFRS, the insurance guys, IOSCO, IFSB, the World Bank has been there for some time, and last April at the IMF spring meeting in Washington, Christine Lagarde and her number two, name escapes me, the gentleman from China, and all the team at the IMF came out strongly in favour of the principles of Islamic finance. And for years the IMF has kind of been in the closet, but it's now openly declaring that this could be the best thing since sliced bread, and we should pay serious attention to it. And that I find very encouraging, because for years we've lived on the periphery, and we have had our own conferences and discussions, and very rarely have we interacted with the big boys. Now we regularly interact with them, and they invite us to debate and discuss. But that actually means that we've got to raise our standards, and I don't mean by that standards of regulation, but our education standards, and the people who are going to debate and discuss there need to be top-notch. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to get, I'll put it this way, found out, because we haven't got people who can stand their ground and argue. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that kind of time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can see there are a few other hands up, but I'm really sorry we can't go on because people have to go for the lectures at 6, and also the lecture starting at 6. But I really like to thank those who are experts, even though some of them might not have got a chance to speak, but also those who came here to learn about Islamic finance. And I think we couldn't have had a more lucid as well as up-to-date presentation than what we got from Daud Vicary, whether it be about the concept of interest or risk sharing, or what is ethical finance, or what is Sharia, the objectives of Islamic law. So I think this has really been a treat. And I'd like to really say that we're really privileged to have you, and thank you so much for being there. We hope to have you back again.
I look forward
Thank you,
to it.
Daud. Thanks. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you to everyone. We'll be in touch. Please ensure that you have